My name is Dr. Josephine Palermo, and my superpower is creating business cultures that transform organisations team by team. Today, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Nicholas Conigrave to our conversation about leadership as a learning activity. Nick has a vast track record and is passionate about working with leaders, building their capability to create organisational environments where people can flourish and do their best work. His passion for working in education began when he co-led the Leading Australian Schools program, a collaboration between Hay Group and the University of Melbourne between 2006 and 2011. He was a founding member of the Global Education Leaders program and continues to work with education system leaders to put in place the conditions that enable high quality teaching and learning. I think you're going to love this conversation. Hello, Nick. How are you?
Good, JP. Lovely to be with you.
Lovely to be here too. I know we've been trying to do this for a while, so it's fantastic to have you on the podcast. And today I'm excited because we're going to talk about your fabulous new paper, which is called Leadership as a Learning Activity. You recently wrote that for the Centre for Strategic Education as part of their Learning Education series. So we're going to dive into that. But before we do, I'd like to introduce you to listeners, and I'm really proud to say that you are a fantastic colleague of mine. We've done a lot of work together, and I love your work. I love working with you, and we've just recently become co-directors with another two colleagues of the 16 Conditions Australia Pty Ltd
Yeah,
organisation. So, congratulations to us.
yeah, very exciting. Very exciting.
So Nick, tell us a little bit about yourself. I'd like to hear about, all the things that are important to you and have led you to here.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Josephine. So I feel like I'm in my third, if not fourth career, but I started back in the mid 80s as an accountant in London. And that was my first experience of what was a pretty dysfunctional organizational culture. Wasn't much fun. Didn't last very long. Spent the next 10 years in advertising, both in Australia and Asia. And while it was a good fun sort of career, it sort of lacked a sense of purpose. I didn't feel it really wasn't so engaged with selling wet cat food, as I like to say. And so I went back to university and did studies in organisation behaviour at Swinburne. And the first text I read there, the foreword of the author, his intent was to make organisations fit for humans. And I was really
Love that.
engaged with that. I was like, wow, like I want to do that. And so I was really blessed. I found my way to a company called Hay Group. And I spent nearly 20 wonderful years at Hay Group, mostly in their leadership development practice, but also in their building effective organisations practice, and became a partner, and we ended up selling the company. And that's when it led me to sort of branch out and see a broader world beyond Hay Group, which was, I was very deep and in narrow in their technologies. But moving to EY, helping the EY business build out a leadership practice, really expanded my horizons, and I got to engage with some fantastic colleagues. Dr. Ruth Wagman, who I brought to Australia on behalf of EY, who we are now colleagues with. Professor Bob Keegan, and Lisa Leahy of Immunity to Change fame and Everyone Culture fame, who are just, giants in the field.
Amazing thinkers.
Jervis Bush, who I think has done some of the most interesting work around a technology called Clear Leadership, which I think is really adding something to the whole. And so it was a real moment for me of just recognizing that there was such a broad landscape. And the other part of the puzzle was I got to work with Oxford University through EY on an Australian major projects leadership academy for 4 years. And that really brought me into that whole idea of, actually, it was one of my colleagues, Atif Ansar from Oxford. The first question he asked me was, what are you writing? And that really challenged me to think about, well, how am I putting my ideas down and making them known? So hence, 4 years later, after Atif challenged me to do that, I wrote this paper.
That's fantastic. And you do get to that moment, don't you, where perhaps sometimes you do need a little bit of a push because you've obviously had this really deep experience in leadership development and working with so many different clients across different industries, but also working with these amazing researchers, academics, and thought leaders. And of course, that really influences you. And isn't it amazing? Someone says, "Well, what are you writing?" And that takes you on a journey of, well, actually, I could write something.
Yeah, it's funny that I feel like I've been saying the same thing for 25 years now, but it's only made sense once I've written it down and put it into a sort of a coherent narrative. And uh, it's been really interesting, the responses to the paper. A lot of people have found it quite challenging. The idea that leadership is actually a learning activity seems to be revelatory, which surprises me because for me it seems sort of so obvious, but it's not obvious, and it's not obvious in a lot of organizations today.
No, it's not obvious. And I think that that's the thing. When your ideas, you live your ideas, and you've immersed your work in that idea or those sets of ideas, and it isn't necessarily obvious to others. So Nick, what is that? What does that mean that leadership is a learning activity? Do you want to give us that kind of overview so that we understand what we're, what do we mean by leadership and learning?
Well, actually, leadership, the very term itself is very contested. So my colleague at Oxford University, Graham Findlay, did a Google search of the term and found 5 million hits of books and journals. So everyone has an opinion about leadership. So
Yes.
I won't get into the definitional wars, but I will say that if we look at the environment that organisation leaders are living in, the term VUCA, that volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environment that we live in. There's so much change afoot. Like business models are, being turned on their head. We have 4 generations of workers working together. We have hybrid working post-COVID. We have climate change. We have, the whole the work around diversity and inclusion, which is so important for today's work. So there's a lot of complexity, and I would posit that for leaders to be effective in doing that work, which use Heifetz's term, that adaptive work, that leaders need to learn their way forward. That it's not about actually, leadership is not about having answers, but actually asking the right questions.
Mm.
But the problem I find today in organizations, and I put this in the paper, is that I think the sort of learning that I'm talking about is conspicuous by its absence in organizations. So the sort of learning I'm talking about, happens on the job, in service of the work, in social setting, together with others to do the work. And so I asked the question of the reader, how often do you sit in meetings, with teams, problem solving or trying to deliver work? How often do you ask open-ended questions? And second question I ask is, how safe in those environments is it for you to try something out and fail, to get it wrong? And the third part of it is, well, actually, how is learning actually designed into the way the organisation is actually run? So the operating model, the organisation structure. And so I use that as a sort of a question, and then I come to conclusion that actually it's in the main, it's absent. And therefore we have this issue that if leaders are not learning their way forward, then how are they dealing with the adaptive challenges they face?
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of learning and the absence of learning that you've seen, could you give me some examples just to really bring that down to perhaps experience that people can relate to? And then we'll go into a little bit more around sort of what the paper delivers for us. But because I know that you've had a lot of experience with leaders, so does an example come to mind? You don't need to divulge
No,
names or
yeah,
anything
but I
like
can talk
that.
about a team I was working with. A colleague and I have been working with this team for 2 days to set them up for success as a team. And this was a senior executive team in a larger institution. So they were a pretty important part of this institution in terms of its functioning. And so they'd spend 2 days together to work out how they could be more effective as a team. And then we said, okay, let's do a work observation. We'll sit and watch you work and you do your work. And then we'll, debrief and see how you're putting into practice what we've discussed over the last 2 days. So they did that, and we sat, like flies on the wall, watching them work. And at the end of the 1 hour, we did a debrief and asked the question, how did that go? And a number of people offered, sort of positive, that went well, and, we're doing well, and tried to see the positive sides. But then one of them was brave enough to say, actually what I experience is this sense of I sort of we all line up to say what we know, and say what we think. And so the question I follow up with was, what's the implication of that? And he said, well, and he came to the conclusion that we spent the 1 hour telling each other what we already know.
Interesting.
And so that's, if you think about it from that Heifetz and Linsky, technical versus adaptive work. If you are Heifetz talked about the fact that the biggest issue in leadership is that we use technical solutions to try and solve adaptive problems. And so if you are staring into adaptive challenges in organizations and you are only working from what you already know, you are by definition failing. So it's that, and it's the other side of it, and colleagues who have done this work with me over the years, the number of peer support groups that we have set up and as a core part of any sort of leadership development program. This is leveraging off the great work of Richard Boyatzis and peer learning groups, is about creating a space where peers bring their adaptive challenge and get the support of their peers. It's not dissimilar to Rita Evans's action learning, where they get the support of their peers to help them solve their problems. And the instruction to setting those groups up is, don't tell your colleagues what you think. Ask them questions to help them learn more about their problem. I mean, this is, Kurt Lewin's work around, we learn best when we discover it for ourselves. But in trying to train leaders to ask open-ended questions in peer support groups, which is as safe as you could get, is like pulling teeth. It takes time, and they do get to it, and then it becomes a way of working and they love it. But it's just not natural. It's not built into the fabric of organizations today. And so I think this is where it's incumbent upon leaders to recognize that they need to, bring it to the center of their role.
Why is it difficult, Nick? What are you seeing?
Well, this, so actually Ruth challenged me on this when I said to her, because Chris Ardress has a wonderful definition of learning, which is the identification and correction of error. And every time I've said that to an executive, you see them wince in this sort of discomfort. And Ruth's challenge is a good one, because that's not the only definition of learning, but it is a definition of learning. And it's certainly, actually from the neurophysiology, it's actually very accurate. I won't get into that detail, but it's really interesting that, and he talks about the fact that identifying and correcting errors is potentially threatening and embarrassing. And so I think it hooks our amygdala, our emotional salience of our emotional intelligence, if you like. It hooks that anxiety of, we can't be seen to be wrong. And
yes,
the idea of competence compulsion, which Jervis Bush talks about. So that I think in a professional setting, incompetence is seen to be professional death. So to be seen to not know is culturally not acceptable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that concept of competency compulsion. I think that we live with that, and we don't even understand, or it's not made explicit or conscious that we're actually behaving in that way. And a lot of this is about getting people to be more effective in their decision making, in their collaboration with each other, and to your point, in facing into adaptive problems, which is the problems of business, but also the planet. So we can't just bring people together and be satisfied with people just telling each other what they know. And you're right, And what I'm really curious about is this idea of open questions, because I think we've been talking about open questions for a long time in the social sciences. But what is it really to ask an open question?
Well, it seems so simple and yet so hard. So an open question is one to which there is no answer. You don't know the answer. They tend to. I have this sort of rubric or sort of heuristic of short questions, long answers. More often than not, you get long questions which sort of embed the answer in the question, and short answers. So it's interesting. There are different ways into this, and I was working with a group recently that asked me, what are my three favorite open-ended questions? And that led me to thinking that actually the way maybe I'm tasking groups is too open. So I was working with another group and I said, when you're listening, so the task was you're going to listen to your colleague who's going to explain their change challenge to you for 5 minutes. The only thing you're allowed to say is this question: tell me more about ... And that ... was any word in that sentence that you found interesting. Anything. It could be any word. Just tell me more about, collaboration. Tell me more about anything. So that was the only question. And I was working virtually at the time, but I was debriefing with the client who was in the room, and we laughed the fact that instruction had about a 10-second half-life, because within about 20 seconds of doing the task, they all just got back into conversation. So it's a lot safer to be in conversation because I'm not really putting myself out there. I'm not asking questions. So I might ask you a question to which you don't know the answer. I might professionally embarrass you. Or I might ask you a question to which you don't know the answer and you'll get angry at me. So the relationship will get damaged. And so I think it takes, generosity of spirit. It takes time because you've got to want to listen. It takes compassion for yourself and for other, because you're going to ask someone a question to which they've got to really sit back and go. And when you've asked a good open question, someone sits back, their eyes roll up, they sort of go, that's a really, and they learn more about their own meaning-making system. And it does take courage, because you've got to firstly admit you don't know the answer. And then you've got to deal with the fact that if they don't know the answer, they might get angry at you, or, cut themselves off for you or whatever. So.
And I think this is really important when leaders are, dealing with their peers as well as their direct reports. I mean, what better way to develop staff that are reporting to you or, you're collaborating with than really help them to go into this process of inquiry. Nick, what are some examples? So they're examples of good open questions. What are some examples of questions that are kind of disguised as they're leading questions, or they're disguised as open questions, but they're not really open questions?
Or the classic stem of that, have you thought about?
Yeah.
Yeah. Or the other version is, I'll give you all my experience and then ask you a question to which you should give me back the answer I want. And that's why short questions, can you tell me more about what do you mean by?
Yeah.
I mean, the question, what do you mean by? It assumes you don't So I was doing what we call, back in the Hay Group days, a behavioural event interview, which is a data gathering process for an executive assessment. And, the training was, and this is partly where I think I was trained, was that you don't assume you know what someone's thinking, because you've actually got to get into their intent. And so when an executive said to me, I said, what was your thinking? He said, well, I wanted to make a profit. My follow-up question was, what was your thinking behind wanting to make a profit? Now, most of us would just assume that we know why he wants to make a profit, but the discipline was I had to ask him and not assume. And I think, and the thing is, it's not to ask open questions all the time, because if all you did was ask open-ended questions, you'd infuriate everyone you were with. So there is a balance in this, but I would suggest that the balance is far too much on making statements of what you know or asking closed questions to which you want the answer. And so I'm advocating that we bring some, and it's, what David Bohm's dialogue talked about, advocacy and inquiry. It's not an absence of advocacy, but it's how you can create something that's co-emergent. And I do think in these complex times, if teams can create enough space where there's a bit of not knowing, and we can co-emerge a story together that actually finds a way to bring our different experiences to coalesce around a choice, then we're aligned, and now we work together, and now we speed up. So I think that sort of slowing down to speed up idea is available to us.
Yes, absolutely. And Nick, I learn from you all the time. I learn from you when I watch you work with teams, and I used one of your techniques the other day where I had an executive team, and one of the members said, I agree with that. And then she went on to say, and I stopped and I said, what do you mean when you say I agree? What are you actually agreeing with? And then it opened up a conversation, because actually she didn't agree.
Well, I love the other one is, I want to build on that.
Right.
Well,
yes.
Really what you're saying is, I just want to say what I want to say, pretending I'm building on that. So it's because if
Yeah.
you're really building on that, you'd actually ask more about, well, what do you mean by that?
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
yeah.
Now, in the paper, you talk about environmental conditions that are important. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, and that feels like such a Dorothy Dixer JP because this goes into my one of my great heroes in the field is Kurt Lewin or Kurt Lewin, is depending on your pronunciation.
Yeah.
And he wrote the paper back in 1935 that posited the idea that the behavior that we observe, the phenomena, is something to do with the person in their environment. And if you look at that equation, it seems like a very simple equation, but it's like a fractal. It's simple, but it's complex. And so I would argue that the majority of the work that we've done in leadership development in my time, and then I look back over colleagues in history, has been too focused on the individual. It's been too much, and you can see it in the whole. We've been trying to kill off the heroic leader metaphor for a long time, and I know this is
Yeah.
very much embedded in the patriarchy, which I know is very much in your
Yes.
wheelhouse. But the idea that the environment made me do it. The idea that actually it's the person in the environment, the complexity of that, and really getting into that. That if we can, I think we've ignored the environment because it's too complex. We don't know how to get to it. But I use a quote in the paper, and I should probably go and find a proper quote so I don't misquote Joan Lurie. But Joan's work was, doing some work with her when I was at EY, and she made this statement. I'm paraphrasing, not to insult her exact words, but she basically said, it's not the system out there that's the issue. It's actually the system inside the leader themselves, the mental models they hold, the
Mm,
frames, it's the assumptions and beliefs they hold that actually co-create the system, the environment in which we find ourselves. And while that is complex, I actually think there's something in the magic of that gives us agency and license to not just take what we're given, but to collectively work together to co-create the sort of work environment. And I think this is what culture is. But I think culture feels like it's very hard to get at and it's too big. And, how do I work with that anyway?
yeah.
So that's a long-winded answer to your very short
No,
question.
not at all. Not at all. And I agree with you. I think that we have a lot more choice and agency in that when you think about it that way. But often, I come across a lot of teams, a lot of leaders who are almost feeling quite hopeless in the face of systems that perhaps don't allow them to thrive in the way that they would like. But at the same time, they're not having discussions about the kind of environment that they need to thrive or the kind of environment that they could create
Yeah.
to thrive. So I think that there's a lot more agency and choice in that.
I was working with an executive team once, and it fascinated me that one of their sort of sidebar conversations was them whinging about their travel policy. And I sort of looked at them and begged the question, so whose policy is it? And it was as though they had no capacity to actually change the policy of the company when in fact they ran the company. And so I think we all get trapped in these mental models, these little cul-de-sacs of belief. They atrophy into place and we don't feel like we can get at them. But, when you ask the question, actually, why is that there in the first place? What is that all about? I think we start to open up possibility. Uh,
Absolutely, absolutely. And one of my favorite questions is, if this was easy, what would we be doing? Particularly when I used to do a lot of work in process change and development, that was a great question because
but that's
it,
but that's even a great open question, isn't it?
yeah, it
What would
is.
we be doing?
What would we be
Yeah,
doing? Yeah,
yeah. Sorry,
absolutely.
I cut you off.
No, no, that's fine. That's fine. No, but I actually used that question a lot to help people understand an alternative reality that
Mm,
they had control over. For example, this was when I was working with a number of people who controlled the risk emergency procedures of the organization. They were the decision makers, and yet they were hamstrung by the structures and the systems that they had control over. So
yeah.
it's that very structured way of thinking about things differently and doing it collectively too. Because I think that there's a power in having a discussion and a dialogue around those things as well.
But even in that, what else? What would it look like if it was simple, JP? that is a classic reframe to look at it from a different perspective, see a bigger picture, to decenter, to step back, and take that, and that's that taking that more systemic view, that system, that self-transforming mind view that Bob Keegan talked about in his level of consciousness. That idea that if we can just see more, further, farther, then we can make sense of the complexity, make better sense of the complexity that we're operating within.
Absolutely. And Nick, in your paper, you talk a bit about perhaps why sometimes we don't necessarily by default see that. And I think you talk a lot about a concept of immunity to change in the paper. So do you want to just briefly talk about that for the time we have left?
Yeah, so there's two sides of the coin. It's that person and the environment. I think there's something about the person that we're sort of wired for safety. Kahneman talks a lot about how we jump to conclusion, system one thinking, that we have heuristics that help us make sense of the world. And so I think we tend to avoid ambiguous environments, which, create anxiety. We jump to conclusion through system one thinking. And also, we've already talked about that competence compulsion. And on the environmental side, Bob Keegan makes the point that organizations are designed for delivery, not development. And we need to, be designing organizations that are delivery and development. And also in their wonderful book, The Everyone Culture, they talk about, everyone's got two jobs. So the culture is one that, we've got our first job we're paid for, and the second job is looking good. So we've all got two jobs, and the drag that causes. And the third is, I think, the organization design is just, the art of coming up with the least worst structure. And, all those boundaries create barriers to learning. So it's not designed in or incentivized. And then I go into the paper to describe 5 or 4 different frameworks that I particularly hold in high regard, and the practice of open-ended questions. And I just offer those frameworks, sort of short descriptions. They're 1,000 words a piece of, Bob Keegan and Lisa Leahy's wonderful work around immunity to change, which I could recommend to everybody as a way to really get in underneath the underlying beliefs or assumptions that are holding us back from really achieving the growth and development that, we individually and collectively want. And that, their text on that is a very easy read. It's very easy to put into practice, but it's so deep it's really, simple, not simplistic. So it's the depth of thinking that's gone into it's really beautiful. So I think that's a great frame. Should I go on and just describe the other 3?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
And then, so there's the art of the open question, which I talk about and give some ideas about how you can do that more often. I then, the other frame that I've spoken about, Jervis Bush's work in clear leadership, which really starts from the premise that we all having a unique experience, and that the problem we have is that when we don't understand the experience the other one's having, that jumping to conclusion, we make up stories to fill in the gaps. And this is not a bug in the system. This is actually how this is our neurophysiology and how we're wired. And so the problem is that because we don't check out those stories we've made up about the other, we act upon them as though they're true. And all of a sudden we have, the elephant in the room, the interpersonal mush that gets in the way of us effectively partnering. And I think he's developed this great technology called the Experience Cube, which is, again, looks simple, but, there's real depth to it. And it's a way of putting into practice skills on the job to actually have learning conversations to help us actually learn more together. And I think it seems to, in a really interesting way, de-escalate conflict and make it much easier to actually to partner with others. So I think that's, again, each one of these has got a book, of course, if not 2, that you can read. And I do encourage the reader to actually, because one of my things is I find it sad that so many great giants in the industry are sort of forgotten. We seem to continuously reinvent the wheel. Yeah. So I encourage people to go back and to read, Reg Revens, 1930s, Mary Parker Follett, 1920. I mean, these are folks who have gone before us and have had really great insight, and we should build upon that. And then there's the wonderful work of Ruth Wagman and Richard Hackman and colleagues, Deb Noons and Jim Burris, around the 16 conditions, which, you and I have talked a lot about. Teams being a great place to build leadership capability, but teams are the place where we will solve complex adaptive problems. So I think it's a teams are the answer to the problems we face, and building high performing teams. And so there's a lot of work out there, a lot of views on high performing teams out there. I think Ruth and the team have got the best science and the best art and practice of that. So, and then the final one I think is Heifetz's work around adaptive leadership, which for years, leadership without easy answers, which is his first text on the thing. And then I've been working with his practice guide that he and Marty Linsky put together with Grayshaw, which is a fabulous, just a how-to book on such a complex topic. But I just think adaptive leadership really is the frame for our times, because it begs the question: if you're doing adaptive work, you've got to start from a position of not knowing and give yourself permission to not know, because that's okay. And it's not that you're going to sit in that position and not know forever, but you've got to have some space for that in your day if you're working in teams through great partnering that's set up through that sort of skill of clear leadership. So that's my advocacy, if you like, for bringing learning to the centre of your leadership role through these frames.
That's wonderful, Nick. And I love that. I love that as you say, many of these concepts are simple but deep. So it's deep work, but very accessible. Where can people get your paper from?
So it's currently on the Learning Creates website, and Learning Creates Australia is a fantastic organisation, the not-for-profit sector, set up by Tony McKay and Jan Owens to advocate on behalf of transforming education in Australia around the world through, collaborative work through networks. And so I'm really proud that Learning Creates is seen fit to put it up on the website. I know that Centre for Strategic Education is currently rebuilding their website, so it's not currently accessible there.
So we'll put that link in the show notes. And you've got a new paper that's just coming out. Are we allowed to talk about that?
Well, we are, but because this won't go out until after. That's
all right. Do you want to show it? Maybe just show it. Just out today.
So Tony and I have Tony McKay and I have written a paper called "Leading the System Toward Transformative Learning for All," and it's our. I'm blessed to work with Tony, who's really one of the leading lights in the education transformation space globally. And he's been a dear colleague of mine since the early 2000s when I worked with him on the Leading Australian Schools program. And so he's really brought the outside-in global perspective, and I think the best work out there about how do you transform a whole system. And my job was to really synthesize that into sort of taking that theory and putting it into practice. So it's a bit of a how-to guide. It's dangerous to say that because it's obviously a fairly complex task. So it's frames, not answers, but it certainly advocates that we need to redesign the operating model in education if we have any chance of, educating our children in a way that they can thrive in this complex world that we live in. And I just think that the current education system is leaving too many children behind. And for those children that are doing okay in the system, it's not really benefiting them as much as it should. So we're hoping that it's useful for system leaders, be they teachers, principals, bureaucrats within an education system or system leaders as a whole, that they might find something in there that will allow them to see their system a bit more differently and allow them to have a sense of agency to advocate on behalf and actually deliver the sort of child-centered learning, student agency is the new word, that we've been advocating for years. So, yeah, that's very exciting. So hopefully after June, mid-June, it'll be out and about and people can grab that too.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Nick. And people can find you where? Is LinkedIn the best place? We can put
probably a LinkedIn profile would be the best place to find
me. And it's Nicholas with a Nicholas. Yes.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Nick. I loved this conversation. I know it's going to be something that many people will be able to relate to. So thank you so much for your time. We'll have to come back and have another conversation about perhaps each of these areas in a bit more depth, because I think we could definitely do that. So Thank you so much, Nick. And I'll talk to you soon. We'll see you soon.
Thanks, JP. See you soon. Bye.